He had never seen his bride's face. The marriage was arranged. For land, not for love. Folks said she was so plain that men turned away, and women never bothered to be jealous. Beau Radcliffe signed the marriage papers the way a man signs a business deal. Without hope, without expectation, just duty. Until the moment he lifted the veil. And standing before him wasn't the kind of beauty folks wrote songs about, but a pair of eyes that made the whole room go still. Without saying a word, she shook everything Beau thought he knew about appearances, about obligation, and about himself. Texas, summer of 1886, blazed like a hammer's strike and hushed like an unspoken curse. The wind rarely deigned to sweep through this parched land. Only red dust hung in the air, as if the sky itself waited for someone to settle an old debt. Beau Radcliffe stood by the porch railing, his gray-blue eyes scanning the sun-scorched prairie stretching to the horizon's edge. His family's spread, Radcliffe Ranch, had once been the pride of the region, where horses snorted gravel dust and children grew up with stern gazes. But that was in his grandfather's time. Now, it was a battleground for a war without gunfire, between Beau and the man who'd sired him. Inside the weathered wooden house, his father, Montgomery Radcliffe, sat behind a dark mahogany desk, clutching an unlit cigar, his lips holding a sentence poised to become law. He'd once said, "You don't need to love, Beau. Just marry the right one." Today, he meant to repeat it, the 10th time, or perhaps the last. "She's got land," Montgomery said, his voice steady as hooves clipping stone. Beau didn't reply. He'd heard that part before. Land to the east, near the foot of Dry Creek. A patch few bothered to glance at, unless they needed a winter pass. "The Lows have no one left but that girl, Juniper," his father went on, "and she's old enough to wed, or to waste away in that rotting wooden house." Beau's hand tightened on his knee. Juniper Low, a name like an old tale half forgotten. They said she wasn't pretty, not the kind of plain that stirred pity, but a quiet ugliness that made men avert their eyes and women spare their jealousy. No one had seen her in years. No one knew if she still breathed or had dissolved into the dust like her mother before her. "So, I'm just marrying land," Beau said, voice low. "Not a person." Montgomery's eyes narrowed, an imagined wisp of cigar smoke curling between them. "Land is the person. A face doesn't yield crops, but a boundary line builds a legacy." Beau rose from the chair, slow. He didn't shout, didn't slam the table. He only looked at his father, the man who'd wed his mother for 200 acres and a well that never ran dry, then walked out of the room, as if sidestepping a wreck by refusing to ride through it. Outside, sunlight slanted gold across the faded roof tiles. The cattle stood still as stone statues. In this place, no one moved without reason. Beau passed the horse stables, the weathered fence, and reached the line of ancient cottonwoods. Each step pressed into a past that didn't feel like his own. On the porch, the day's last light spilled across the earth, stretching tree shadows into long gashes like cuts on skin. He stood watching the horses in their pens, creatures free within confines, and wondered if he was any different. Juniper Low, a name like dry leaves in a forest, small, brittle, easily overlooked. They said she'd lived alone since 17, after her parents succumbed to pneumonia. No visitors, no sightings. They whispered she was plain. But in this land, who had time to sift truth from gossip? Beau had once thought if he had to marry, it'd be someone who made him want to ride home early. Someone who made silence feel easy, and darkness less lonesome. But life under Montgomery Radcliffe's shadow left no room for such dreams. Here, love was a luxury, something no one brought to the bargaining table. Night fell. No call for supper. No lamp left burning in the main house. Beau sat alone in the stable where the scent of old hay and the breath of horses became a lullaby. In his hand was the marriage contract, unsigned. Under the faint glow of an oil lamp, her name appeared like smudged ink, Juniper Low. He didn't know her face, her voice, her dreams when she gazed west, only that she had land. And in Montgomery's world, land was the only thing worth marrying. The night breeze slipped through the stable's slats, carrying the rustle of brittle leaves against the roof. In Beau's chest, something stirred. Not quite refusal, not quite consent. Just the faint crack of a thought. Was he locking himself into the same cage his mother had lived in? Morning broke as if darkness had never been. His father said nothing more. He didn't need to. Everything was arranged. The bride, the land transfer, the ceremony set, all signed, except for one line. Beau sat in the room where his grandfather had taught him to read land maps, where his mother had sewn shirts by hand, where he'd once believed he could carve out something different. A gust slipped through the open window, dusting the desk with red grit. He picked up the pen. His hand didn't tremble, but his heart did. And then he signed. Not for duty, not for inheritance, not for land, but for something he couldn't yet name, a flicker between curiosity and resignation, defiance and a plea, a gap yet to be filled. Perhaps at the end of this dust-veiled road, there'd be nothing but disappointment. But maybe there'd be eyes that met his straight on, and for the first time in his life, he'd see himself reflected back. And so Beau Radcliffe, son of a legend, heir to a name, signed a contract with a woman he'd never seen. A marriage written in black ink and red dust. A bargain that, only later would he learn, held no clause to measure what waited beyond the veil. Callahan Chapel lay 6 miles south of Radcliffe Ranch, tucked behind 2 ancient cypress trees and a dry creek bed that had ceased to flow the year before. The small church, its white walls yellowed, its wooden roof cracked, held rows of pine benches, unpadded, where weary feet and worn vows found their truth. No flowers, no music, no blessings whispered. Only the wind slipped through the door's slats, tugging at thin curtains as if ready to carry the whole chapel away. In this land, love, if it existed, rarely came with ceremony. And today, love was not on the guest list. Beau Radcliffe entered the church alone, his white shirt tucked into dark khaki trousers, collar buttoned tight, hands carrying nothing but his name. On the front bench, his gray cowboy hat rested upside down, a rare sign he was taking this seriously. The pews held only a handful, an aging pastor with clouded eyes, 3 women there more for curiosity than goodwill, and 2 ranch hands from a neighboring spread, their hands still caked with earth. No one smiled. No one spoke. They sat like silent witnesses, there to confirm this marriage would indeed take place. Beau sat, back straight, eyes fixed on the old cross hanging on the wall, its wood split by time. He didn't pray, but he didn't look away. Then the back door creaked open. No prelude, no murmurs of awe, just a sudden gust sweeping in, carrying fine dust and the scent of dry grass. Juniper Low stepped in, or rather, appeared, like a quiet gray streak against the golden light. She wore an ash-colored dress, high-necked, long-sleeved, unadorned by lace or bow, its only allure in its stark simplicity. A thin veil draped from her head to her chin, the sunlight filtering through, rendering her face a soft blur, indistinct. Her posture was neither frail nor defiant. Just a woman walking toward something no one had taught her to prepare for. Beau didn't rise as she entered, not out of rudeness, but because he wasn't sure his legs would hold. He glanced at her a single second, then looked forward again, as if fearing her gaze might unravel something he'd just signed into being. She stopped beside him, not too close. No perfume, no whispers, only a faint breath, enough to tell him she was real. Pastor Whitman rose, his trembling hands opening a small book. Marriage is not a transaction of land, but a union of two souls. To others, those words might be mere ritual. To Beau, they cracked something open in his chest, a small fissure. He tilted his head, glancing at the girl beside him, who in moments would bear the Radcliffe name, live under his roof, sleep in the next room, and call him husband. Beau Radcliffe, do you take this woman to be your wife, to live with her in fidelity, in poverty and wealth, in sickness and health, until the end of the road? I do. His voice carried just enough. Not certain, but not hollow. Juniper Lowe, do you take this man to be your husband, to build a life together, keeping your vow, though the heavens shift and the earth changes? I do. Her voice was smooth, low, and deep, like an underground stream, its surface hard to see. Just 2 words, yet the chapel seemed to shrink, leaving only the echo of a commitment unadorned, and for that, not easily undone. Beau, the pastor continued, you may lift the bride's veil. Time stilled. Beau turned, facing for the first time the woman he'd just called his wife. His hand rose slowly, not trembling but not decisive. He touched the veil, cool, light as morning mist, and lifted it. As the thin fabric parted, light from the window above poured onto her face, a quiet revelation. She was not beautiful, not in the usual sense, not by the small town's measure of soft faces, wide eyes, long hair, and pale skin. Her face was sun-darkened, lean, her lips unpainted, her chin sharp, her nose bearing a faint break, as if once struck by something now nameless. But her eyes. They neither sought approval nor shied from scrutiny. They stood steady, bright, and deep, like still water that could reflect oneself if one dared to look long enough. In that moment, Beau forgot where he was, forgot his father's demands, forgot this was merely a marriage for land. He stood there, facing a woman he'd never met, and realized she'd seen through him before he'd learned to see her. No one in the chapel spoke. No one stirred. It was as if they witnessed not a wedding, but a descent, where a man first saw himself in the eyes of a woman who demanded nothing and promised nothing. Beau lowered his hand, his gaze unbroken. Juniper stood still, not smiling, not flinching, not speaking. Yet in that silence, he heard something no one had ever said to him. I'm not a prize. I'm not a bargain, but if you stay, I won't turn away. And he knew then something had shifted. Not loud, not a blaze, just a change like a mist breath, making everything after it impossible to reclaim. The ceremony ended without a kiss, without applause, without gestures hinting at joy. Just a brief handshake with the pastor, a quiet nod, and then both turned toward the door, like actors finishing a scene in a play they hadn't chosen. The wind outside seemed to have waited. It surged as the wooden door swung open, sweeping a dry tumbleweed into the wide sky. Juniper reached up, unpinning the veil from her hair, folding it neatly as one might an old letter. Careful, unhurried, neither reverent nor careless. Beau glanced at her hand as she held the fabric. Long fingers, faint veins under sun-browned skin. A hand not made for silk or flowers, but for work, for holding what might slip away. She didn't look at him, didn't speak, but she didn't need to. And for the first time, he didn't search for words. They walked side by side along the path to the horse yard. A short distance, just a few dozen steps, yet it felt like a chapter of life turning. The wind flicked through, dry grass, boots struck hard earth, the old sounds of the Wild West, and amid it all, Beau felt a clarity. Maybe he'd been wrong. Not about marrying her, but about thinking a story told was a person known, wrong to believe silence was empty, simplicity was lack. That being unwanted meant being unworthy of love. And if her gaze when he lifted the veil was truly unscripted, unadorned, then perhaps all he'd taken for truth these years was merely a thin haze over life. Some hazes don't need sunlight to lift, just someone gentle enough to look through. The Radcliffe house, like its name, was built to endure, not against storms, but against the slow decay of time and unspoken things. Hardwood beams, a thick roof, windows shuttered most of the year, and a long hallway that seemed designed to keep its inhabitants apart, even while living under one roof. After the wedding, the town let the matter fade in a day. There was little to say. No flowers, no wine, no music, and not a single smile soft enough to temper the memory. Beau brought Juniper home in a wagon, the two of them seated in the same cart, but far enough apart to avoid brushing skin, shoulder, or words. When the wagon stopped at the porch, he stepped down first, offering his hand in a thoughtless gesture of courtesy. She took it, brief, light, decisive. He opened the door, letting her enter first, not out of politeness, but because he wasn't sure what else could mark the start of a new life with a woman he couldn't yet fathom. Juniper stepped into the house like one entering a land freshly abandoned. No surprise, no hesitation, just a quiet measuring of the unfamiliar with her eyes. She stood in the parlor, high-ceilinged, floored with old brick, a wall clock frozen since last winter, and said nothing. Beau pointed to the right hallway. "Your room's down there, mine's across." The word "your" slipped out slightly off-beat, borrowed from another life. Juniper nodded. No questions, no complaints. She took her small drawstring bag, stepped into her room, and closed the door so softly the wind outside sounded louder. The next morning, Beau woke to the sound of the front door shutting. Not loud, but firm. Dawn was still veiled in mist, the sun yet to crest the horizon. But already the kitchen carried the clink of a glass on wood, the rustle of turning pages, and the scent of old-fashioned coffee seeping through the door's cracks, like a language needing no translation. He came downstairs, hair still damp with sleep, and froze in the kitchen doorway. Juniper was there, in a plain cotton dress the color of earth, her hair neatly pinned, hands resting on the ranch's financial ledger, a thick, worn book no one had dared touch without permission. She turned its pages slowly, her eyes not lifting as he entered. "Reading the ledger?" Beau asked, voice hoarse. She nodded. "You left it on the table." "Because I hadn't put it away. And I hadn't asked." Her reply held no challenge. It was just true, as if she knew she was stepping into another's territory but didn't seek permission. Not out of disrespect, but because she believed this place would, sooner or later, need another pair of eyes. Beau sat across from her, the wooden chair creaking under his weight. He didn't ask why she rose so early. Didn't ask how she knew numbers. He only looked at the woman before him, his wife by law. and tried to reorder what he thought he knew. She wasn't beautiful like a poem, but beautiful in a way that commanded respect. She spoke little, but each word was a pebble dropped into a well, rippling to the bottom. And there she sat, in his house, reading the ledger as if it, too, was a task she'd shoulder alongside him. Beau poured himself coffee, his fingers faintly trembling. He didn't know what unnerved him more, that she wasn't what the rumors claimed, or that those rumors had blinded him for too long. The days that followed passed like wind through a door's slats, silent, but not gentle. They lived at opposite ends of the house, like poles of a storm yet to break. They didn't share meals, didn't ask what the other ate. Only once did Beau leave a basket of apples on the kitchen table, and the next morning, Juniper had baked a pie from them, its sweet tang left in the oven for him without a note. She cleaned the house unbidden, swept dust from the attic, fixed a broken hinge on the kitchen cabinet, washed the bed linens with herb-scented water. She did it all as if she'd always lived here. No permission, no excuses, no waiting for thanks. Beau watched her actions, first with suspicion, then hesitation, and finally in silence. She didn't try to impress, didn't shrink to fit acceptance. She simply lived, leaving him to face himself, the man who thought he knew how to handle an unwanted wife. At night, the glow of her oil lamp spilled through her door's crack, reaching his wall like a faint breath. He lay still, eyes open, watching that light and wondering what she was doing, writing a journal, reading the ledger, or just sitting, like him, waiting for the silence to pass. Their silence wasn't an enemy, nor was it a friend. It was like a wild creature, untamed, ready to roar at any moment or curl up and sleep forever. One morning, Beau entered the barn and found Juniper poring over the livestock log. She'd marked pages with mismatched notes, listed missing vaccinations, and noted long-absent workers. He stood behind her for a long moment, unsure if he should speak, then said only, "Where'd you learn this stuff?" Juniper didn't turn. She answered softly, "No one survives a winter alone without learning to look at everything closely." Beau didn't reply. He just nodded and turned away. But in that nod, something fell away. Like the first shard of ice melting in the heart of a man who thought he needed no one to share his name, his bed, or his weariness. He wasn't sure he knew who she was anymore, but that, for now, felt like something worth watching unfold. The wind that day blew strange. It didn't come from the south, where the sun usually sank behind the trees, but from the northwest, from the barren stone ridges where nothing grew but fear. It carried a faint, acrid scent, like smoke from an old dream, and Beau sensed it before the ranch hands came running with the news. He stood by the eastern fence, hands gripping a weathered post, when the horizon blurred, as if someone had smeared paint across a canvas. A heartbeat later, shouts broke from the ranch, urgent and fractured in the gusts. "Fire! Behind the stables!" No hesitation. Beau vaulted the fence, boots pounding dry earth, gravel dust scattering under his heels. He bellowed for those nearest, his voice hoarse, blending with the wind and the thunder rising from the ground, as if the land itself were answering back. Arms scrambled for buckets. Hoses were linked, wet blankets wrapped around tree trunks. It was chaos, a war without horns or drums. And amid it all, he saw her. Juniper. Not in a doorway, not at the dining table or bent over a ledger, but in the thick of smoke and flame, sleeves rolled to her elbows, skirt hitched to one side, feet planted as if she'd lived her whole life on this field. She carried 2 buckets from the water tank, steady, unflinching. When a young ranch hand stumbled, choking on smoke, she didn't step back but hauled him to his feet, firm and swift, as if she'd done it 100 times. Beau froze for half a second, just long enough to see he'd been wrong to think she couldn't stand against the wind. "What the hell are you doing here?" he shouted as she rushed past, hair tangled, cheeks smudged with ash, but eyes still clear as glass. "Keeping the stables from becoming a grave." Her voice broke through the wind, not weak, needing no repeat. A pillar of flame licked the wooden wall by the barn, and they both lunged forward. No time for surprise, no time for distance. They stood shoulder to shoulder, hands yanking a soaked blanket, splashing water on the smoldering planks. The fire roared in their ears, as if demanding they choose. Flee or stay. Beau turned, breathing hard, face flushed from smoke. "You didn't have to do this." Juniper stood beside him, hair slick with sweat, hands coated in ash, and met his gaze, not accusing, not proud, just spoke in a voice soft, but solid as a driven nail. "Like you didn't have to look back at me. But you did." In that moment, there was no wind, no roar, no commands. Only her words, falling through the flames like a small pebble stirring ripples in a long, still lake. In the end, the fire didn't claim the stables, but it left its teeth marks on charred boards, on ash-flecked grass, and in the silence that followed, a silence no longer so distant. Juniper sat on the porch steps after the flames were doused, a wet cloth slung over her shoulder, eyes tracing the ash-strewn yard. Beau stood nearby, saying nothing. Both were exhausted, soaked, smeared with soot from head to toe. But neither had backed away. Neither shied from the other's gaze anymore. Beau sat down, not reaching for her, not offering thanks. He spoke low, as if a louder voice might turn it into a bond. "I didn't think you'd do that." Juniper tilted her head slightly. "Because you thought I was just the land you married?" Beau didn't answer. He didn't need to. Amid the smoldering ash, one thing was clear. He no longer saw her with his old eyes. After that night, when the fire was out, Juniper hung the bucket back on its wooden hook, wiped her hands clean, and returned to her room as always. But Beau lingered, staring at the scorched wall where the flames had nearly devoured the stables, wondering why the feeling in his chest, something between gratitude and guilt, burned longer than the fire itself. Fire, they say, is for destroying. But sometimes it's the only thing hot enough to melt the ice people forget they carry within. And that night, in the ash and smoke, Beau Radcliffe no longer saw Juniper as a wife by duty. She was a woman who could stand in a storm and not step back. Some changes come quietly, like seasons shifting in the night. You only notice when you wake, and the scarf on your shoulder no longer feels warm enough. After the fire, the Radcliffe house grew quieter. Not the stifling hush of before, but a stillness that let you breathe easier, as if the smoke had swept away the last dust lingering between them. They still lived at opposite ends of the house, but the doors no longer closed completely. The scent of Juniper's evening herbal tea drifted across the hallway, mingling with the faint tobacco from Beau's side, and oddly the two smells didn't clash. That night, for the first time, they ate at the same table. No one invited the other. Juniper set out the meal as usual: pumpkin soup, cornbread, a portion of stewed beans, but didn't leave the kitchen afterward. Beau, after wiping his hands, stepped into the dining room, and instead of heading to the back porch as was his habit, pulled out a chair and sat. Neither spoke. Knives brushed plates lightly, spoons grazed bowl rims. The silence stretched, not awkward, not heavy, just a longer breath shared by two people unaccustomed to sharing warmth. As his bowl neared empty, Beau spoke unprompted. "Why do you wake so early?" Juniper paused, her spoon hovering mid-air. She looked at him, not surprised, but as if weighing whether the question was genuine care or belated courtesy. "Because dawn is the quietest time," she replied. "Before the world wakes, it feels like it's yours alone." Beau nodded, saying no more. But he understood. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he truly listened to an answer without rushing to respond. Juniper began spending evenings on the front porch. She sat there, the wooden rocking chair creaking softly, a book in her hands, lit by the golden glow spilling from the parlor. Her back straight, her eyes focused. Not the distracted glance of leisure, but the serious read of someone for whom each line was a matter of survival. Once, as Beau passed by, he glimpsed the title, Gentling the Wild Mare, an old book, its spine peeling, about taming horses no one dared approach. He chuckled softly, not mocking, but surprised. "You like training books?" Juniper didn't look up. "I like how people are patient with things they can't control." Beau didn't reply, but her words stayed with him all night. Days later, when the wind carried the scent of the town fair, candied apples, fresh hay, and fiddle music, Juniper carefully hung up her apron, tied her hair, and slipped into a pale blue dress. Beau saw her at the mirror, adjusting her collar with a light touch, as if she did it not for anyone but herself. He asked, half teasing, half earnest, "You want to go?" She turned, catching his gaze through the doorway. "I do," she said simply, then asked, "Are you coming?" Beau wasn't one for fairs, but that morning he changed his shirt, combed his hair, and hitched the horses as if preparing to meet a formidable rival, or something he wasn't ready to name. The town buzzed louder than usual. Colored cloth hung on ropes, voices called out, boots thumped on dusty roads, children darted like water spilling from a barrel. But when Beau and Juniper stepped down from the wagon, the bustle seemed to slow. All eyes turned to them, or rather, to her. Not because she was strikingly beautiful, but because she was the woman everyone thought no one would marry. And now she stood beside a Radcliffe. Juniper didn't lower her head. She walked straight, steps even, her gaze unflinching. She didn't smile or flaunt, but her back stayed unbowed, her stride never faltering. Beau watched the stares, the whispers, then looked at her, not to gauge her reaction, but because he felt proud. Not the pride of a man with a woman at his side, but the pride of someone watching a misunderstood wild horse step into the light, needing no one to lead it. They stopped at a bakery stall, where an older woman handed out slices, asking with unguarded concern, "You're Juniper Lowe?" "Yes." Her voice was low but clear. "I'm Juniper Lowe Radcliffe." The woman blinked, then nodded, hesitant at first, before offering a slice of apple pie. "Try this. It won the prize this year." Juniper took it, said nothing, but her eyes softened. She took a small bite, chewed slowly, then said, "The cinnamon's a bit subtle, but the crust is just right." The woman chuckled. Beau, standing behind, smiled too. Not for the words, but because, for the first time, he saw Juniper relax in a world that had always looked at her half-eyed. On the way back, they said little. Only the steady creak of the wagon, the clatter of wheels on stone, and Beau's arm resting lightly on the seat's edge, close enough to feel the warmth from her shoulder, but not close enough to touch. Juniper turned to him. You know, she said, they didn't think I was good enough for them, but I didn't think anyone was good enough to see me as real either. Beau glanced back, eyes fixed ahead. Maybe because most folks look with their ears. She laughed, for the first time, a small, dry, but true laugh. And you? She asked. What do you see me with? Beau thought for a long moment. With what you leave behind when you walk out of a room. She didn't ask more. But this time, as the wagon jolted around a bend, they leaned toward each other just a fraction, and neither leaned away. It wasn't love yet. But somewhere, in a small question, an old book, a glance without judgment, Beau and Juniper began to build something, not of wood or names, but of a shared silence that needed no explanation. The morning sky was gray, as if holding its breath. The sun hadn't fully risen before a thick cloud slid across the mountain's peak. No rain, but no one would call it a sunny day. Beau Radcliffe stood in his father's study, a room so familiar that every grain of wood, every shelf, every speck of dust was etched into his memory from the days when he was shorter than the windowsill. But today, for the first time in years, he stood there as a man, not the heir, but someone ready to let go of what he'd once thought he had to keep at all costs. Montgomery Radcliffe sat behind the oak desk, still as a carved statue, his eyes the only living thing, sharp and cold. On the desk lay an unopened newspaper, a cup of coffee steaming faintly, and a letter received that morning, unsigned, bearing only a few terse lines from town. Your daughter-in-law, Juniper Lowe, appeared at the fair with her husband, speaking calmly, holding her head as if she truly bore the Radcliffe name. She doesn't suit it. Montgomery didn't need to ask who wrote it. Those who'd been denied entry to the Radcliffe circle always found ways to chip at it. Nor did he need to verify the truth. To him, a public display was the face of the family, and he didn't care for someone who carried dust daring to stand beside a legacy. Beau stayed silent. He knew well. Every talk with his father wasn't a dialogue but a chess match between holding on and letting go, between inheritance and freedom. Finally, Montgomery spoke, his voice low but firm, like hammer strikes on an anvil. She's making you forget who you are. Beau didn't react at once. He only tightened his grip, nails pressing into his palms, testing if he was steady enough to stand his ground. She's made me remember who I am, he replied, voice calm as the earth after a heavy rain. Montgomery's eyes narrowed. You're trading everything for a woman who brings nothing but trouble? Beau took a step forward, the space between them now mere inches and 2 decades of difference in how to live. No, sir, he said, eyes unflinching. I'm refusing something that's kept me living all these years, without feeling I was truly here. The air thickened, tangible. Montgomery gave a faint laugh, the kind he used only when about to pass judgment. You've forgotten what this family was built on, Beau. Not feelings. Discipline. Blood that knows when to stay silent and choose the right gain. Beau nodded slightly. I know. And maybe that's why Mother stayed silent her whole life. The laugh on Montgomery's lips died like embers doused with water. He stood, slowly, hands on the desk as if about to issue a command. If you choose her over this family, don't expect to keep any part of this land. Beau exhaled long, not from fear of loss, but from knowing he was about to release something tied to his very sense of self. Then, take it all. His voice was soft, almost regretful, but his eyes held a light that wouldn't negotiate. If legacy means I have to deny the one person who makes me want to stay, then I don't need it. No one spoke after that. In the room that had been the heart of the Radcliffe clan, the silence wasn't empty. It was an aftershock. Montgomery looked at his son, searching for the boy who once fit in his lap on Sunday mornings, but the man before him no longer waited to be named. "You disappoint me," he said, voice dry. Beau didn't blink. "Then for the first time in my life, I'm not like you." He turned, walking out of that room, crossing the threshold that had once been the line between duty and desire, between preservation and courage. No one called him back. No one shut the door behind him. But his footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, step by step, like a quiet declaration. If he had to redraw the lines of his life, he'd be the first to dare erase the old ones. Dawn in Texas was the gentlest light this land ever knew. It didn't barge in like noon sun or sear like the afternoon wind. It crept through windows, falling softly on the earth, as if asking permission for everything to begin anew. Beau Radcliffe held the reins, one foot in the stirrup, then glanced across the yard, where Juniper was securing a pack of provisions behind her saddle. She wore an earth-toned shirt, hair neatly braided, not a single piece of jewelry. But Beau swore that since waking that morning, he hadn't been able to look away from her once, not for her appearance, but for her steadiness. The way she fastened the saddle straps, the way she checked his horse's gear without a word, the way she existed, quiet, unassuming, as if the world had never needed anyone's permission to let her be herself. They didn't speak during the preparations, but this silence wasn't like the early days. Not heavy, not guarded, just trusting enough to need no words. Juniper nodded when she was ready. Beau nodded back. And so they rode away from the ranch's back lot, where the red dirt road stretched toward hills that, from the main house, were only a faint green blur. No one asked, "Where are we going?" No one said, "We'll be back." Just the steady tread of hooves, the creak of saddles, and the wind threading through their hair. When they reached the hill's crest, the sun had risen just high enough to cast their shadows onto the earth, long, but no longer pulling in opposite directions. Juniper reined in first, her hand lightly gripping the leather. Beau slowed beside her. From where they stood, the land unfurled like a map freshly opened. Cottonwoods in the distance, a dry creek snaking through a gully, scattered wooden houses in the valley below, and the horizon, a green thread that never broke. Juniper turned to him, no smile, but her eyes were enough to make a man see himself whole. "I used to think," she said softly, her voice like earth after rain, "that if someone looked at me long enough, they'd see all the parts of me that aren't pretty." Beau met her gaze, unflinching. "And I used to think if no one looked close enough, I wouldn't have to see what I lacked." A strong gust swept through, kicking up fine dust from the ground. The horses stamped, but both riders stayed still. Then Beau reached out his hand. Not rushed, not pressing. Juniper looked at it, the hand that had once carried the chains of a name, a memory, a duty, now open like a blank page. She placed her hand in his, no promises spoken, no vows sworn, just a palm that didn't pull away. And in that moment, Beau Radcliffe knew. When he'd signed that marriage contract, he'd thought he was marrying a shadow. But it was she who helped him see himself most clearly. He saw that land didn't make a man. It was how a man chose to hold it, and who he chose to hold it with. As they rode down the other side of the hill, the sunlight climbed, higher, glinting off dewy grass. Behind them, Radcliffe Ranch stood unchanged, a piece of memory that didn't need tearing down, but no longer held sway. The road ahead wasn't clear. No one had mapped a place two people in agreement could reach. But perhaps somewhere wasn't a destination. It was a state where you no longer felt alone. And the horses, the wind, the red dust, and two people who'd once misunderstood each other set out as if everything was only just beginning. A journey. Not because they knew for sure, but because for the first time in their lives, they chose to ride for each other. If this story stirred something quiet in you, we'd be honored if you gave it a like, subscribed to follow more stories like this, and left a comment sharing what you might have done in Beau's boots. Every word you share helps keep the echoes alive.